your name says peace. What does that mean in terms of your life?
You know, when our teacher gave me that name, I said, what? Peace? I wanted something like fearless or something that would make a change in the world. And with our teacher's insight, the Dharma names that we're given are actually things for us to practice with. Now, theoretically, we could all practice with all things, but I thought it was interesting that peace was the name I was given. And with time, I began to realize, well, for all the fearlessness that I wanted, for the capacity to be, fierce for good, the underpinning for that was to be peaceful myself, to have peace. Because if I could touch that peace, then that meant I had no fear. And it was a wonderful awakening or realization to have that to be fearless actually means to be peaceful. And that's something that I've tried to practice with in every day, and also to have a view, if I could, of peace, which is expansive.
What does that mean, being a woman of colour and experiencing racism and coming from generations of people who have been discriminated against? There's a lot of anger and humiliation and all sorts of emotions wrapped up in that. What does peace mean in relationship to that?
It was after I arrived at Plum Village that I really got a chance to look more deeply at things like discrimination and my own ancestry as an African American. And the current climate in America has also helped me, or has caused me to really see it in a way that I never had before. If you grow up in America, and if you are an African American or a minority, you wear that difference in your person, in your body. And you are discriminated against every day of your life. Every day. Nowadays we hear about microaggressions, but there are also micro-discriminations. And they may be innocently dealt, but nonetheless felt. And to be able to recognize that has been a good thing. And it's been able to help inform me that some of the people who may act or say things in a way based on some misperceptions, I recognize, well, that does hurt. And you never get used to it, even though people may say, oh, you get used to it. You really don't. You always feel it. I remember as a little girl, my grandmother used to take us shopping. And it was just around still the latter part of Jim Crow. And she would always get dressed up and go to the best stores. And she would find a dress she would like. I said, well, Grandma, why don't you try it on? No, I don't need to try it on. I'll try it on at home. Only later as an adult did I realize what she was saving me from in the store, which was the humiliation of knowing that colored people, as we were called then, couldn't try on clothes. And there were many things that our parents, protected or did their best to protect us from, but those things still continue. We've heard President Obama say that as a senator, it was difficult for him to stand on K Street in Washington, D.C. and hail a cab. I worked for the office of the mayor before I coming here. And if I really needed to get somewhere and I needed a taxi, what did I do? I grabbed one of my colleagues that looked like you. Come on, I gotta go. And they knew, hail a cab, and I'd get in it. Or what it's like to go into a store and be followed just because of what you look like. I've never stolen anything in my life, but there was the presumption that I would. These things follow us everywhere. So here I've been able to see into this a little bit more deeply and to recognize that all of us are inculcated and taught through the convention of our society that these things that aren't true are true. We call it, in terms of police, racial profiling. And it is a custom in every aspect of life. Even here in Plum Village, I've been subject to it out of innocence, but nonetheless, it's there. But also, again, having the chance to see deeply. People may have a certain view of us, even though with my Vietnamese sisters, I actually share more of a reality than not. The fact that both of our communities, both of our ethnicities were oppressed. In the case of the Vietnamese, the Chinese, and the French, in the case of African Americans through slavery. And sometimes, the discriminations also come from ourselves. And that's something that many people maybe don't recognize is there.
So how do you feel about a lot of minorities under Donald Trump's incoming presidency are feeling very fearful that progress that's been made towards more of an equality will be eroded or even dismantled, and that people are now living in fear? If you are a member of a minority community feeling that, what is your suggestion of what you can do about it?
Right, so in that context, if you're a woman, if you're a person of any color or ethnicity, if you are of a sexual orientation that's different from what some say is the norm, though that's questionable, you are fearful, and you do have some despair, and I understand that deeply too. I certainly have felt that here. And what can we do? Well, we can embrace all that we are as being okay. We have to really protect ourselves into buying into what we hear about ourselves, and to know that that's not true, that I'm okay as I am and who I am. I remember when I went to South Africa, went to Africa for the first time, went to South Africa, to Botswana. And I had a very interesting insight. I couldn't wait to go. I said, oh, what would it be like to be in a country where everybody looked like me? And when I got there, it was a wonderful feeling. And I began to meet people in high places, matrons of hospitals, chiefs of staff, attorneys, and they all looked like me. But there was a part of me that was doubtful. And I couldn't understand what made me feel so uncomfortable that all of these beautiful people were in positions that I would rarely see at home. And I realized it was because what I was taught at home, what we're taught at home, that somehow we were different, and if we were in these positions, we would offer less than. my parents and my grandparents would go to Jewish lawyers, say, or doctors, even though they were African Americans at the time, because they believed that they were less, somehow not trained as well. When in fact the opposite was true. They had to be stars just to get into the schools. And so there's still a lot of things about ourselves that we need to look at and we need to embrace and we need to heal, so that when we hear this rhetoric coming from outside, we can know that it's not true and we can hold on to a sense of balance and peace in ourselves. And that would be the first step.
When it comes to a movement, for instance, like Black Lives Matter, is that a movement that you support, or do you think, because some people say, because Buddhist philosophy is around equality, that there's no difference, there's no non-discrimination, and then some people say, well, Black Lives Matter movement discriminates because actually it makes only Black Lives Matter, and some people say all lives matter. So it's got into that whole sort of. What's your view on a movement like that, and how it can be most effective?
Yes, I understand. And if you're a person in a place such as myself, you hear it differently. And I hear how the others may hear it in still another way. And from the perspective, I think, of Black Lives Matter, that matters, whether it's brown, black, red, yellow, or white. There's maybe one little word that's missing, but that's assumed by those of us who would fall in this category. And what they're really saying is Black Lives Matter too. Not that the other life is less or equal, but all lives matter. But at this particular point in American history, there needed to be a way to voice it. There needed to be a way for others to hear, even though it may be difficult. Now, on the other side, those who say, oh, all lives matter, or white lives matter, or any other life matters, instead of hearing that Black lives matter too, they're hearing their lives matter less. And that is not true. That is not true. So I think that if those who may feel threatened, because in America, the dynamic for racism and discrimination has always been to have at least two groups against each other. And as long as one was feeling superior, they could look away from oppression and what was happening to the other. So this now wakes us up into thinking, no, wait a minute. Is that what I've been doing? Or that's what someone else has been doing? And even if I haven't been doing it, is that what I believe? Because that's what permeates in the culture. So for people who feel fearful about that, I think, no, don't think of it in terms of your life doesn't matter. All lives do matter. But right now, for this particular group, what we're saying is Black lives matter too.
There's a lot of talk about, with the incoming president, about the need people are waking up to the risks that progress that has been made may be eroded or dismantled, and that people need to take action. There's this renewal of this idea of activism. From your perspective, what does activism look like, and how, from a Buddhist perspective, can people make more of a difference if they really sort of start to think about it?
I think that there's a broad arc of activism. We talk about peace in ourselves, peace in the world, and that is very true. And we hear that it starts with us, but at the same time, some groups, there's a level of angst and anticipation and anger and passion to want to move towards and do something. So how do we reconcile, the chasm between the two, coming back to ourselves, breathing, walking, being radical in our presence of mindfulness. And how do we then not lose sight of the fact that some of the things that we as Americans have taken for granted, some perceive are quite at risk right now. And so how do we get from here to there? Or what is the practice? And suddenly an image comes to mind. Our teacher is great friends with Dr. Martin Luther King. And we know of the marches across bridges. And we've seen films about what's meant when a peaceful, nonviolent group meets another. And though we don't want to meet that again, if you know what those civil rights advocates, they trained for that. They trained, they learned, they were taught how to be quiet, how to be still, how not to resist, and fighting back no matter what happened. Not only, I think, just physically, because I don't believe that will happen, hopefully it wouldn't happen here, but it does happen on other ways. So how do we prepare ourselves? How do we train ourselves? And I think we do it as a group. We do it as a Sangha. And when we've looked and we see examples around the world of how countries who've had civil strife for a long time, South Africa is an example, they had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and groups that came together and they just listened to each other's pain so that they could understand what action or non-action caused in one, and the other listened to the same. And I think that as we can work on ourselves and we come together with Sangha and we have that collective sense of trying to work these things out, and it's going to be difficult to try and listen to another that has a different view, especially if you sense that view is threatening you. But if we flip the coin and say, well, those who may have that view, they're in fear of something too. And that fear may be that the dream of their grandfathers is no longer accessible to their grandchildren. So will they do anything? Will they ignore some truth in order to take care of themselves? This new minority in America is in a lot of pain. And we see it in the drug addiction that is now being categorized as people needing treatment. 50 years ago, it was criminal behavior. So we have to come together and we have to be able to listen deeply to hear what those struggles are and to see, oh, right, I did have that view. I did think that. And I want to understand why and how I did. And this is on every side. I don't want to say both sides because there's more than two sides to a coin. And I think that we can begin to march toward that progress if we do it collectively. And I think everyone in America does want to do that. And at the same time, bearing in mind, and there will be those I like to think like a Thurgood Marshall, who could very methodically plan and be patient to turn things so that we did get the civil rights legislation. And there are those among us who can be methodical, and I'll use the word apolitical because they do have the greater good in mind, to assure that the things that we hold so near and so dear are not at risk. And when they send up the flag or the alarm to say, folks, we have to come out and we have to show what we think in a nonviolent way, then others will be ready to move.
Some people will say compassion looks weak. This is an era where you're getting one side potentially being very aggressive. We've seen a lot of acts of racism and violence and Islamophobia, etc., grow since Trump has won the election, and when that level of violence comes towards you and fear, like compassion can look very weak, and a lot of people say actually, no, you meet violence with violence. You've got to match the action with the action. What would you say to them?
It's true. Just in the case, for instance, of the idea of so-called political correctness sort of going out of the window. But in fact, the elephant's been under the carpet in the living room the whole time. Nobody just talked about it. Compassion can be quite strong. It can be, when I say strong, it can be a force of good. And I think a recognition of that is, even though people may come to us with violent things to say and possible violent action, if we can be strong in ourselves, then we could offer a resistance that is nonviolent. I know that that sometimes can sound a bit foreign, and what can one do in that situation? But as we've already begun to take care of ourselves, we've already begun to listen to what the other is suffering, we can recognize the suffering in that instant. We can call it by its name. And that is probably one of the most powerful disarming tools that we have, to not ourselves offer the aggression, but instead to say, I see in you that you are suffering, and you're probably suffering because of this. And just that one moment, that one instant is enough for the tension to reduce, so that the violence or the propensity or the chance of violence dissipates to a more manageable level. But that means that we ourselves are at a place where we can have that recognition and we can offer that to another. And that is a great, great source of love, and having the other feel they're being recognized, listened to, and embraced.
You come from a tradition on two sides, Martin Luther King and then Thich Nhat Hanh, from your Buddhist tradition, who are both great friends and both work together to bring about peace. What have you learnt from them? Because they both talk a lot about community. They both look about peaceful action. But when you go behind that, what is the essence of, as individuals who did bring about change through their activism, but from a peaceful perspective, what is it you've learned from them as individuals that were able to do that?
Well, both of them were rebels. Both of them were revolutionaries. Both of them were activists, but not in the conventional sense. We now, with the arc of history and time, we can see just how revolutionary that they were. And they were also fearless and not afraid to work for what they believed in a different way, despite perhaps the forces around them. To suggest, in the case of my teacher, Tai, one of my teachers, because I consider Dr. King a teacher as well, during the time of the war, it was the North and the South. And people were angry at him because he wouldn't choose one side or the other. And they would say, well, what side are you? And he said, where are you from? Which side? He would say, I'm from the center. And it was, which means I don't want war on either side. I want that thing called peace, and I want to fight for it in that way, hopefully without anger. This is what he teaches us, not to be angry peace activists. And I think this is what Dr. King also taught us. After his meetings with Thai, he came out against the Vietnam War, and the people around him were uproarious. Oh no, you're going to put at risk all the work that we've done for civil rights, and we need to that's not our business, let's just go for it. And he said, how can I ignore the human rights infraction that's happening to my brothers and sisters in Vietnam? So they had the courage because they had the insight, and they themselves had a deep spiritual dimension in practice. If religion isn't your thing, you don't even have to characterize it as religion. But they had this mooring, they had this anchor, deep spiritual well from which to draw upon, and they stayed true to what they knew to be best. And in those times, it did work. It did in fact work. And it even cost one of them their lives. But that wasn't enough to deter from what was the great action. So I think to do the work that we need to build up our own spiritual well, to help others do the same, to listen to others, to act in a way that is going to save lives and not cost lives, and to know that despite what others may sometimes say, other views, and I think it's important, let me say, that you do hear other views, because I think that helps to inform what needs to be addressed, but that ultimately we can come to resolution without war. And by doing that, we also have to recognize that we have to take care and heal the wars within ourselves.
And just finally, Sister, I mean, you talk about this spiritual well that they could pull sustenance from. Just in very practical terms, if someone is young and sitting out there and saying, okay, I hear that sounds true, but what do I do? Mm. People get to that place where they might have a realization, but then the next question is, but what do I do to get that? I want a well. I want a spiritual well. How does someone go about developing that sustenance?
Well, from our Buddhist perspective, we have our practices that we encounter. We have what we heard about earlier, about our 5 mindfulness trainings. And we have a group called Wake Up that really does appeal especially to young people. But I would also say, like I was taught when I grew up, who close to you, who in your community do you respect? Who do you think has courage? Who do you think has depth? Who do you think has a spiritual dimension? Or that which is within them they can call upon? And I would say, go to that person. That person's not very far away. Someone in your family, someone perhaps in your school, or your church or religion. But I would say, look towards, or if it's another teacher, gravitate towards that and learn more about it and be active and participate in it. Because until we try these things out, how do we know what's going to work for us? So it really is looking, listening, and acting on that intuition so that you can have direct contact with whoever your teacher is. It may be a coach, it may be a teacher, it may be one of your parents or grandparents, but whoever it is, these individuals are closer to you than you think.
Thank you, Sister Peace.